A video game soundtrack is an art style that you listen to. It's a big part of the thematic atmosphere, and helps the listener form expectations about the tone of the game as a whole, even for those of us who don't know anything about music. Anyone can feel the darkness in a minor key, or the harmony between a root and its fifth, even if you've never heard those terms. That's why in the opening sequence of NieR Replicant, we can tell even with our eyes closed that this game is going to have some emotionally heavy themes. I mean, anyone who's ever heard of NieR probably already knows that, but that's beside the point. The very first piece that plays, titled Snow and Summer, is bleak, eerie, and complex, just like everything director Yoko Taro makes. And while the opening sequence would be moody and disquieting all on its own, the same could be said of the music that plays during it. Keiichi Okabe and his studio MONACA have repeatedly made soundtracks that keep fans thinking about their games long after they finish playing them. But why? What is it about this music that feels so heavy? By taking a closer look at the composition of Snow and Summer, we can start to answer that question. First things first. NieR Replicant was released in 2010 in Japan. When it was re-released in 2021, it came with a new soundtrack. The compositions are more or less the same, but the instrumentation and mixing are very different. The original soundtrack focuses heavily on vocals and percussion, while the new release includes and spotlights more instruments and moving lines. Both soundtracks have their fans and their haters, but we're only going to look at the newer soundtrack, partly because there's more to talk about for this particular track, and partly because that's the version of the game I have access to. After navigating the opening menus to start up a new game, these are the first 5 seconds of NieR Replicant. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. Well, not a lot, but something. I can't think of another video game whose soundtrack starts with a boys' choir singing a cappella. Most video game soundtracks don't have choirs at all, and this one opens with nothing but. Just those 2 pitches. They're in perfect harmony, but the unexpected and church-like sound immediately catches the listener off guard. Already, the atmosphere of the piece is pretty well established. In addition to the unusual instrumentation, or lack thereof, there are also reasons for this in music theory. The main one is that Snow and Summer is written in a minor key. Nearly all music outside of jazz is either major or minor, and a lot of music switches partway through. Major keys generally sound happy or peaceful, while minor keys generally sound troubled or dark. But there are many pieces written in minor keys that don't feel thick and heavy the way this one does. Part of it too is the very slow tempo and lack of strong rhythm, which make the music sound sad and desolate. The song Everybody, Backstreet's Back by Backstreet Boys is written in the same key as Snow and Summer, but it doesn't have this atmosphere at all. Here's what the pre-chorus would sound like on a slow, sad piano. Another element at play is Keiichi Okabe's use of dissonance. You can't really tell when you hear them in context, but there are a couple very gross chords in this phrase called tritones. We hear this tritone twice in the first 8 measures, but context is very powerful, and so they sound perfectly fine in the piece. Still, they add tension to this phrase beyond the bare minimum for a minor key. There are also many accidentals in this piece, which are notes from outside the current key. Between these 4 elements, Snow and Summer quickly tells the listener that something is wrong. The next phrase is actually the same one as before, but now with a 3rd vocal line on top of the 2 we know, and it adds a lot. These next 16 measures are the heart of what we'll analyze in this video. That's the choir part in a nutshell. Let's look at the new stuff in the second half. The first two measures are simple, all single beats with no accidentals, and you can hear it. Even though it's a minor key, it feels wholesome compared to what came before it. It resolves a bit of the tension from the last phrase and doesn't rush to build more. From here, the top line, the most prominent one, stays where it is, while everything under it changes. The first note in the top line forms a tritone with the bottom line, while the next note forms a tritone with the middle line. This is the tensest measure in the entire piece. It sounds terrible out of context. Music can't live in this much tension and sound, quote-unquote, good. So we know that a strong resolution must be coming soon. And here it is. That is a B-flat major chord. This is the longest a single chord has been held since measure 1. And boy is it weird. Even the purest resolutions of this piece feel at least a little off. Let's take a closer look at this B-flat major chord. It has an accidental at the bottom, meaning that this note isn't supposed to be in this key. We're in B-flat minor, and as the name suggests, no B-flat major chords are invited. But part of why it works here is that we were primed by the previous measures to want it. The bottom line is what makes this a major chord, and in the previous measures it leads into this note by semitones, tiny changes in pitch. So when that next step down arrives in the resolving chord, it doesn't come out of nowhere. We accept it as a natural conclusion to that moving line. No pun intended. Because the key says make all the D's B flat, but that symbol says don't do that. Don't flat that one. It's natural. But there's something else strange going on. This all comes together in the first measure of this phrase. It's not unusual for music to end with a very short resolving phrase, but that's not what's happening here, and the bottom line tells us so in the next measure. It drops that accidental back into key, changing this to a B-flat minor chord. Now again, Snow and Summer is written in B-flat minor, so normally this would be a perfectly fine chord to end the piece on, but here it serves as a message that the piece can't be over. And that's because of context. Going from a major chord to a minor one like this is an increase in tension. It doesn't make musical sense to end a piece that way. And not just musicians think so. Here, we can prove it. This is what the piece would sound like if that last phrase led directly into a B-flat minor chord. That sounds like it could be an ending, but here's how Snow and Summer is written. All we've done is add one chord in the middle, almost the same one, and now the ending is ruined. It can't stop there. It doesn't sound right. Even when the phrase does end later, it still carries tension, just a lot less. This is pretty common in video game soundtracks, since most video game music needs to loop indefinitely. Complete resolutions and definite endings are few and far between, but here the unease feels particularly appropriate, because look what we see on screen. 2053, and then summer. It's never clearly stated why it snows in the summertime in NieR, and none of the main lore elements seem relevant to it. If you're really into NieR lore, you may wonder if it's snow at all, for reasons, but look how they're dressed. It's snow. And between the weird weather, the fact that the NieR franchise canonically takes place on Earth, and an NPC commenting that many cities are now under the ocean, it seems likely that the weather is weird not because of fictional events, but real-world climate change resulting in the complete melting of the polar ice caps. That has nothing to do with the music, but it adds some fun existential dread to the title. We loop through the choir part again, and this time there are lyrics. Those familiar with the work of Keiichi Okabe and Emmy Evans know that all the lyrics in the NieR soundtracks are gibberish. Vocalist Emmy Evans was tasked with inventing lyrics for every piece with a vocal part. That voice belongs to a magic book. We'll get there. This is NieR. He's doing his best. The next time we hear music is when we first meet the game's enemies, Shades. Although it's unrecognizable, this weird, distorted bell is actually part of the same piece. We'll see how in a minute. Once the threat is gone, the music fades again and we meet Yona, NieR's sickly plot device, sister. NieR's been protecting her from Shades, but they have no food and he can't last much longer. He has a magic book and he tells Yona never to touch the magic. He touches the magic book! In a moment of desperation, he makes a dark bargain for power and... I would argue that Snow and Summer is heavily tied to the book, Grimoire Noir. This is the only clue so far, but there'll be more. At this point, the player begins rapidly leveling up and gaining new abilities from Grimoire Noir, and the music reflects this growth. At level 3, that creepy ambiance from before slides in underneath the choir, giving it a stronger sense of rhythm. It's not as church-like anymore. There's a definite meter to it. In fact, the distorted bell seems to be exactly twice the tempo of the choir. We're no longer counting 2 slow beats per measure, but 4 faster ones. The choir loop also features some new phrases. The first one to come after what we've already heard begins with, ironically enough, what sounds like an ending. A full 2 measures of a B-flat minor chord. This is a perfect example of how context can change a chord, since this is the same chord that told us the piece wasn't finished just a few measures ago. But it's not an ending here either. It's deliberately misleading. The next measure sounds like the beginning of the new phrase. Actually, it sounds like the beginning of the loop. But it's not. It's the 3rd measure of the same phrase with the false ending, and you can tell by listening to the phrase as a whole. It's pretty disorienting. Here's the end of the previous phrase into this new phrase with the false ending. It's almost as if the bell, and therefore the shades we always see with it, are somehow corrupting the choir part. But the confusion eventually ends. The next several phrases are a true repeat of the original version of the piece. But when we would normally head into, we instead get something new. Does that sound as mournful to you as it does to me? It's the way the notes slowly descend from up high, like a sort of musical weeping. After a few more phrases of this, we go back to some more jumbled, disorienting chords, and then we loop back to the top. And that continues until the player hits level 5, which is when the piece transforms entirely. Strings, brass, and percussion swell in and almost overwhelm what we've heard so far. This is where the updated soundtrack takes a pretty significant departure from the original, adding mallets, a harp, and more moving lines for the brass and high strings. The orchestra also brings in leading lines during the jumbled choir phrases, which lets the choir support a strong melody, and it no longer sounds out of order even though their part hasn't changed. Likewise, as NieR harnesses more and more of Grimoire Noir's power, the threat of the shades quickly becomes minuscule. The Grimoire's strength greatly surpasses theirs. With so many new appearances at once, I could easily double the length of this video if I gave every moving line its due. But I'm going to focus on one: the violins. The violins and choir have the most opposing parts in the piece. While the choir almost exclusively sings notes on the beat, the violins rotate between several counter rhythms, which are rhythmic patterns that don't neatly line up with beats and measures. The violins are also playing 16th notes, while the choir sings mostly half notes. What this means is that on average, for every note the choir sings, the violins play 8. As a result, the piece feels simultaneously stable and erratic. But of course, none of it actually is erratic. Let's walk through how it accompanies the 16 measures we're most familiar with, the original looping choir part. The first two phrases are the main theme, and the second two are the tension-building phrase and then the big resolving chords. We'll call them phrases A, B, C, and D. The violins actually change what they do in phrases A and B depending on where in the loop the track is, and both versions are beautiful, but I want to take a look at the more intricate version of this passage. Since we're mostly going to be talking about the rhythm, here's a visualization that will be more helpful than sheet music. In each measure, there is room for 16 16th notes. Simple enough until you use any other time signature, but that won't be a concern in this piece. The black numbers at the bottom are measures, and the white ones show the countable beats inside each measure. The first count of each measure is on the measure line. Going deeper, each beat is made up of 4 16th notes. The choir is very polite and only changes pitches on the beat. The violins, however, are quite rude. Over the course of these first two measures, they come in 4 groups of 6 16th notes and then 2 groups of 4. Suffice it to say, a new grouping starts every time a note or beat is emphasized. The violins play this rhythm twice through to complete phrase A, with slightly different pitches toward the end. The way it does and doesn't line up with the choir adds texture to the piece, and brings freshness and unpredictability to a motif that by now we know pretty well. Phrase B uses a similar grouping pattern, but syncs back up with the downbeat every measure instead of every 2 measures. We established in phrase A that the violins are doing their own thing. Now they don't have to work so hard to convince us they're crazy. They flow a little more. In the second half of phrase B, there's a quick reference back to phrase A to ground us, and then the violins go wild, driving us headlong into phrase C, which is the main tension-building phrase. Now comes a big change in style. The choir is singing an even, unchanging rhythm, and the violins actually amplify this regularity by adopting a very predictable pattern. The notes are finely gathered in 4 groups of 4 notes per measure, and each grouping exists entirely in support of the highest choir part. A possible reason for this shift could be the behavior of the second and third choir lines. If we think back, this is the part where the top line of the choir repeats itself, but the lower parts break out of the key the second time through and create a lot of dissonance. If the violins were also playing all over the place, it would be really difficult to avoid some ugly levels of discord. Instead, 3 out of every 4 notes the violins play in phrase C are the 1st and 5th notes in the B-flat minor scale. The root and 5th degree of any given scale are the most stable notes in its key, so there's no risk of clashing with anything else. The rest of the notes match the top choir line exactly. In this phrase, the violins are essentially treading water, but the effect is dramatic. Finally, it all comes together in phrase D. The first thing that happens in this phrase is that big B-flat major chord, and the violins present it majestically. Although the counter rhythm here is unpredictable, it is regular, and now the only pitches being played are the root and the fifth, so that nothing can diminish the resolution of that beautiful major chord. As a result, we get an effect like ocean waves, each swell unique, but perfectly matching its surroundings. In the last measure, the violins prep for a leading line that they'll have in the next choir loop. They run up chromatically, meaning with changes of one semitone at a time to build tension. These 4 repeating notes at the end are a tease. They're the first 4 degrees of the B-flat minor scale. As I said, the 2 degrees that go together best in a scale are the root and its fifth. So twice in these last 2 counts, the violins start at the root and promise that the fifth, an F natural, is coming at the start of the next phrase. When that F hits in the next phrase after D, the resolution will feel amazing. Here's all of phrase D and a sneak peek of that next phrase, just so that we can feel the resolution on the F. The best part of taking music apart like this is that it makes it sound even better when you put it all back together, which we'll do in just a moment. We've only examined a portion of the violin part, which itself is only a portion of the orchestra that joined the piece at level 5, but all the rest has just as much care and detail put into it. If Snow and Summer were just an a cappella choir piece, it would still be beautiful enough to warrant making this video. But with these additional layers flowing in and out, it brings so much drama and atmosphere to the prologue of NieR Replicant that by the time the opening sequence ends, we have a firm and accurate idea of what to expect from the entire rest of the soundtrack, and even the themes of the game's story. And just to drive home the dark unease baked into this first track, we hear it one more time at the end of the prologue in another disquieting context, again centered on Grimoire Noir. Here are the final moments of that sequence, and then we'll transition into the 4 phrases we analyzed. Having examined them as closely as we have, maybe you too will be thinking about Snow and Summer for a long time to come.
You need to keep up your straight.
Yona! Yona!
Oh no. I'm sorry, I dropped the cookie. I didn't mean to.
Yona? Why did you?
You've always been the one helping me. So I just wanted to...
No! Yona! Yona! We need help. Please, somebody, we need help. Help us!